Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. So here we begin our afternoon session with Ted Johansson, and his topic is beyond the MVC and object taxonomy for Rails.
Right. Thank you for the introduction with a brilliant pronunciation. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed your lunch and that you're enjoying the conference. My name is Ted Johansson, and now let's see if I can switch now. You can see me in a photo together with some of our interns. I'm from Sweden, but I currently live in Singapore, where I work for a company called Tinkerbox. Tinkerbox is a small Ruby on Rails shop with about 20 people. Where in addition to building Rails and mobile apps, we also enjoy playing a lot of rock band and table tennis. So today's talk will be beyond the MVC. So I would like to talk to you a little bit about Rails, but mostly about things that are just outside of Rails, because I think that we don't talk enough about these things in the Rails community. So we'll take a walk outside of Rails, and we'll look at an extended taxonomy of objects that we can use to achieve better application designs. But first, I would like to give you all a bit of background to at least try to convince you of why we might need more objects in the first place. So when I was a kid, I was a bit obsessed with Legos, and I spent most of my time playing with these colorful building blocks. But before I was allowed to use the real Legos, I first had to pass a test, according to my parents. And if you are a bit obsessed with Lego as well, and you have really good eyesight, you might notice that these are actually Duplo blocks in the photo. And you can think of Duplo blocks as Legos with training wheels. And Duplos were made for people who might accidentally mistake the blocks for food and still allow them to play safely. Duplo is still pretty awesome. It allows you to build things like this fairly quickly. And with a child's imagination, this is a perfectly fine spaceship. But something happened as I grew older, and my craving for block building got stronger, and someday I didn't want to build this anymore. I wanted to build this. But it seemed like with the limited expressive power that Duplo had, this was just not going to happen. This required smaller resolution parts that were more specialized. But what seemed really amazing about these smaller blocks is that I could take any part from this chip and easily put it inside a dinosaur and it would still make sense. And I think that highlighted the flexibility of expression that you get from what's called object thinking. And recently I've been facing similar experiences with Rails. And I started asking myself, is it really reasonable to believe that the complexity of modern web applications can be expressed effectively entirely using terms of isolated resources and CRUD? My experience so far is that almost. And I think if they could, then what we are doing would be pretty boring. But a surprisingly large portion of applications can be expressed this way. And someone once said that Rails makes 80% of your work almost effortless, and then it leaves the remaining 20% almost impossible, which is something that I've experienced at least a couple of times. So what do we say in defense of this? Well, we usually use a variation of this expression, which is we will get the work done with the best possible set of best practices, quality and sustainable life cycles. And at least the last part, I haven't seen that much from my experience in the real world. A lot of the applications that I've been worked with that you can classify as legacy applications have been at least pretty hard to maintain. And I think this is in part because Rails gives us some generic constructs like callbacks and nested attributes to handle those remaining 20% of cases. But from my experience, these tools have caused more problems than they seem to solve. In addition to create some arbitrariness as to which model is responsible for the other models, it also creates some obscurity, and it can introduce some flurries of unintended side effects into your application. And I seem to inevitably and unwittingly tap into this unexpectedly all the time. And my application starts sending out emails or text messages when I do something seemingly unrelated. And I think this makes Rails project tend to calcify a bit over time. Both because of this coupling between objects, but also, of course, because of the tendency of your code or your business logic to fuse together with the framework. And that said, I think this is somewhat expected. Because Rails does an amazing job at maximizing short-term productivity, and it offers some great tooling in that sense. But I would like to contend that there's always some opposition between short-term productivity and long-term maintainability. And we can't really overcome this. And Rails takes sort of an extreme stance on the short end of that spectrum. So a personal hero of mine, Martin Fowler, he hinted at the same thing in a recent blog post that he made in defense of ORMs. He said that a framework that allows me to avoid 80% of repetitive work is still worthwhile, even if it's only 80%. The problem is in me for thinking it's 100% when it actually isn't. And I want to focus especially on the last part here, because I think that it is very important, and it sort of builds the entire premise for this talk. So now you might ask, who is this guy coming here telling us that Rails is only 80% awesome? And is this entire talk going to be a long rant anyway? And that is, of course, not my intention. Despite all the mean things I just said about Rails, I still love Rails. And if I didn't, it would be strange, because I use it every day in my work. And I love Rails not because it's perfect, because it's not. Because I tend to believe that Rails, like so many other things, is a collection of some of the best and worst ideas ever. And of course, without Rails, I would probably not be standing here today. I might never even have moved to Singapore. And worst of all, without Rails, I probably would never have discovered Ruby, which is quite a terrifying thought to me. And Rails, of course, makes it very easy to go from no programming experience to being pretty decent at it. And I think this is the absolute most amazing thing about Rails. It is very inclusive, and we really can't afford to be elitist in the Rails community. However, if we don't talk about the things outside of Rails, both past and future, I think we risk relegating those beginners to mediocrity as well. And as Matt said, we need to evolve to adapt to a changing environment. But to do that, we need to talk about the environment that we're in. So my argument today is, let's stop pretending. And let's look at some other people who stopped pretending and suggested some solutions to the problems that I just highlighted. And this is the more cheerful part of the talk about the object taxonomy. And as a disclaimer, I unfortunately did not come up with any of the objects in this talk. I've only cataloged things that other people have done. So just to reiterate quickly what has happened in the past 5 years or so. When we started out on our adventure, Rails tried to convince us that we kind of only have these 3 tools that we can use to solve any given task. And possibly there's something called concerns as well, but we will ignore those for now. Then something happened. A new kid showed up on the block. an object proposed back in 2010 in a blog post by a guy named James. I don't really know how James wants to pronounce his last name, but every time I see his name, I can only think about this. James, if you're here, I'm very sorry. I have some stickers for you that you can collect. All right. So James called his own idea crazy, heretical, and awesome, which I think might hint at the controversy that suggesting a new kind of object sparked at this time. What he proposed in 2010 was an object that probably a lot of you have heard about at this time, called the service object. Now, fast forward 5 years from when James first suggested the service object, and we have taxonomy of objects. So you might ask, what's up with the Swedish money here? So it's not actually about the money, it's about the guy. This is Carl Linnaeus, one of the most famous Swedish people that ever lived. And he spent his entire life classifying, naming, and cataloging all the species of plants and animals on Earth. And he's also Swedish. So I thought, since I'm also Swedish, and I wouldn't mind having my face on the 100 SEK bill, so I decided to do something like him. Except I only spent a week compiling the list. So here is part of our list for today. Now, this doesn't look like much of a taxonomy, does it? It's only 3 things after all. And the truth is, this could probably have been a 50-minute talk, but I was a bit too afraid to pick a 50-minute slot, so I picked out the most important objects, and then depending on how much time we have left, I will run through some of the others with you. So first out, we have the fabled service object, which is something I heard a lot of people talk about before I finally decided to dive in and see what this mystical object was about. And it turned out this was not very mystical at all, it's just a Ruby object. What is more important is what that Ruby object represents. And I like to think about it conceptually as a use case. If I open the services folder in your application, it should give me a pretty good idea about things that users can do in the application. And this object can help you get rid of those pesky callback chains and give you a more readily testable object, which, despite what some people might try to convince you, is probably a pretty good idea. So the life cycle of a service object looks something like this. It accepts some inputs, it performs some work, normally in the shape of a sequence of steps, and it returns some results. Now, if you're into functional programming, you'll probably recognize this as some kind of a monad. And it's pretty straightforward, really. But we can also ask, what is the result? And I think that's really up to you, depending on what requirements you have. You could obviously return true or false, but I personally prefer to return another object that can tell me whether the call was a success or not, and bring me any errors or data it collected along the way. So I'll go ahead and show you some code. Now, some of the examples might be a bit contrived, but I kind of needed them all to fit into one slide, so you can fill in the gaps yourself. Here's an example of a very, very simple service object. What it does is it registers some user, and it notifies the user that it has been registered in the system. And as you can see, it returns another type of object, which is the result object that I talked about previously. An example of that object might look something like this. It's a very simple object. It can have some data, it can have some error information, and it can also tell you if the call was a success or not. And this is an example of how you might use this in your controller. Right, that was the service object. Next up, I would like to talk about something called a form object. Now, these objects can help you eliminate nested forms. And they can also give you forms for sort of transient user input that doesn't really have a model. They can help you with things like form rendering, validation, and even persistence. So there are two typical use cases. One is when you have a form for more than one model. And then you can think of this as sort of a facade for those models. The other case is when you want some input but you don't have a model for it, in which this becomes sort of a virtual model. A very popular implementation is to recycle some of the active model functionality. And it lets you do a lot of awesome stuff like initialize from hashes and add active record style validations and so on. Obviously, this makes it somewhat dependent on Rails. If you feel this is a bit shady, another popular option is the gem called reform, which is a gem used specifically for creating decoupled form objects. And you could actually also see this form object being used inside the service object that I showed previously. And this is to highlight that objects should really be composable. You should be able to take your objects and make them work together to achieve the results that you want. All right. So last on the shortened list of objects are something called value objects. Now, these don't really augment Rails that much. They are more related to your business logic. And they're lightweight objects. Usually, they bundle some value together with logical operations that you can perform on that value. So it can be things like serialization, transformation, and so on. And I think a really good example of a value object is, for example, a time class in Ruby. You could theoretically pass around an integer that represents the number of seconds since the Unix time epoch or something. But that really isn't a time, is it? It's just a number. And when you're working with time, you might maybe get away with it. But if you're working with something like money, you probably want a value object for that. So the money Rails gem is a very popular gem for working with money. And I think if you've ever worked in an application that deals with money, where the money is passed around as floats, and there is some currency exchange going on inside, and what currency that float is in depends on where you're in the application, you probably suffered some sleepless nights, and you might get why this is a good idea in the first place. So I would like to make some honorable mentions that didn't quite make it into this talk, but they are pretty well documented if you Google them after the talk. The first honorable mention is the decorator, which is more or less a one-to-one implementation of the decorator pattern. So you can think of it as a very lightweight wrapper for your object, usually a model, that adds some functionality to it. The way I've seen this used in Rails is mostly related to view logic. So instead of putting your view logic inside your model, you add it to your decorator and you decorate your objects close to the view. There's also a very popular gem called Draper that does this very well. Number 5 on the list. I think to help pop the Rails bubble a little bit and start looking for things that are happening very close to Rails, but just outside maybe what most of us read from day to day. If you come from another programming background like I do, and sometimes you feel there's something shady about Rails, but you can't quite put your finger on it, then probably you want to get your hands on this booklet. It's called Rails SGE Spoke. And it does a great job highlighting, without in any way being judgmental, where Rails sort of deviates from object-oriented principles and conventional wisdom, and why it sort of gets away with it anyway. I would also recommend you read this blog post by Adam Hawkins. He named it the Ruby community, the next version. He argues that the community has been disregarding some of the fundamental software design principles for some time. And he makes some suggestions for how we can move forward in that regard. And finally, if you want a really amazing mindset that goes really well with the world's best programming language, then definitely pick up this book named Object Thinking. I think this has been one of the most eye-opening books for me as a programmer, and I would definitely recommend it to everyone. Finally, if you think that this is a good idea, or you think you might be able to solve some of your problems, please come and have a chat with me. Even if you think it's the worst idea ever and you hate me because I said mean things about Rails, you can still come and talk to me and I will give you some stickers. But I'm pretty shy, so please come and talk to me. Thank you.
Does anyone have any question?
Thank you. What is your opinion about trade bracer?